Don't be discouraged.
We are going to talk about solidarity, and I am not the expert on that, but Deepa Iyer is. Deepa Iyer is a social justice leader, strategist, and writer. Her book, Social Change Now, is the UUA Common Read. Lovely t-shirt. So if you haven't heard of her before, I am so happy to introduce her now, and I'm ready to cede the floor and the Zoom pin to the wonderful Deepa Iyer. Thank you for being with us today.
Thank you so much, Nicole. I am hardly an expert, just moving on the path with each other, learning from each other, and always learn so much from you and looking forward to our conversation. Hi, everyone. My name is Deepa Iyer. I use she, her pronouns. I am an Indian woman from India, and I've got shoulder length black hair, and I'm wearing a gray t-shirt that says Free DC. I live in the DC area. It is a pleasure to be with you all. The UU community is very dear to my heart, and I want to thank everyone who's put this together as well.
Thank you for that. I love the solidarity stances. I think right now, when it seems like there's so much to be done and feeling like the work that we do sometimes is you as an individual are just so insufficient, right? It's just so insufficient for the tasks that we are finding ourselves in, having that clarity of like, okay, here's what I can do. Here's how I can practice solidarity. Here's how I can do it over and over again and maybe build that capacity, right? And be in a better place next week or in 2 months than I was in the first time practicing it because now I know it better. Now I can teach it to other people. Anything right now for me, I will say, well, I statements, as we say, like it's made me feel hopeful and being able to see a way through with our practices. But as we say, if some of these things were easy, we'd all be doing it. And we wouldn't have to be here, at 8 o'clock at night, chatting about how are we really going to do it, really in practice. So, yeah, to start off the conversation, my first question is, what are the conditions, right, that make it hard for solidarity to be practiced? And how and what do we do to attempt to overcome that?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that there are both internal and external conditions that make it challenging to practice solidarity. Um, External conditions are that we're in constant crisis. And so the ability to deepen relationships and to build relationships, which really is the cornerstone for solidarity. Like I show up for you, you show up for me. We because we know each other, we care about each other. And we want to make sure that each of us can, like as you said, thrive, not just survive. It is hard to do that when we're in constant crisis mode. I think another reason that it is difficult and challenging is because we are often at the mercy of wedge politics, a lot of divide and conquer, right? Where the demonization of certain communities and certain people, or within communities of color, communities being pitted against each other. Those are all external reasons that make it tough to engage in solidarity. Internally, both as individuals and organizations, there are some challenges. So, individually, a lot of times people will say to me, I don't know how to do solidarity. It's too big of a word, it's too hard. And I often say, think of a time when you've either received or given solidarity. What did it feel like? It's a very human response when people answer that question. And that's really what we're going for. That's really what solidarity is. It can be as simple as I felt seen when someone asked me how I'm doing in the midst of a really difficult situation in my neighborhood where ICE was on the street, right? So that's one reason people don't step up because they think that they have to do some big visible action where solidarity can actually happen in a conversation between two neighbors or two young people in a classroom. Another reason that it doesn't happen is because of our organizations or our movements demanding us to sometimes engage in what I call, what others call too, purity politics, where everything has to be perfect. Otherwise, you can't be in the space, right? And those kinds of barriers and litmus tests prevent us from even trying to engage in solidarity. So those are just some of the internal and external conditions that make it tough for us to practice it.
Yeah, sometimes I think about our universalist theology. Right, that it's like, oh, we all have, inherent worth and dignity, and everyone, deserves a safe place, and we all should be able to thrive, and then things happen and you're like, but not those people. I didn't mean those people, right? So yeah, it is especially in these times, I think, difficult to put our values right into practice. Um, when you talk about solidarity, you use the term, right? What are the risks we can tolerate, right? Um, I would love for you to describe why you frame it that way more, but also we talk about the risk that we take on by practicing solidarity. And if you can also talk about what is the risk of not practicing solidarity, right? What is the cost to opting out?
That's actually a really good question. So the reason that we often use the word risk is because it's kind of a responsibility and a risk, right? That solidarity isn't just about like I don't know, like using a hashtag or a slogan, right? Or going to a rally. Those are important things, but true and transformative solidarity should change something, should transform something, something in ourselves, in our relationship with others, and hopefully in the structures and policies that we're abiding by and living in, right? So, in order for transformation to happen, usually I think it requires some level of risk in any sort of transformation, right? Whether it's in a relationship or whether it's to change ourselves, we have to risk something. And it's the same thing when it comes to solidarity practice. And in solidarity practice, the risk can be done in a couple of different ways. It might be a reputational risk that we're taking, that if we stand up for something, we might be branded, right? It could be a professional risk. I think a lot about folks who've stood up for Palestine and Gaza and have lost their jobs, have been detained, have been arrested, have been put in detention centers, right? And the way in which we think about the tolerance for risk is really very personal and very organizational. It's about how far can we go in order to stand up for something that we believe in. But I want to make it clear that it isn't necessarily that we always have to take risks that are so big and so large, right? One example I'll give is in DC when this was actually a couple of months ago when ICE was in a particular neighborhood. I we got a call from some centers in that neighborhood who said, ICE is on in our neighborhood and we want to show solidarity in some way for the community. And they decided to just organize a peace march, literally from, I think it was a school that ICE had tried to go into, from the school to a faith center and back. And it was a quiet, peaceful march. And that's just an example of how even something like that, which happened on the day that that particular school encountered ICE, just made a difference where people felt like they were seen and that they were valued. And so it really is important to think about our solidarity being expressed in these different ways, small and big. Risk and responsibility are often good things for us to think about as we decide how to engage in solidarity.
Yes, and I think more on the deciding how to engage, right, and risk tolerance. Um, in the last two sessions, gatherings that we've had, we've talked about power. How should we think about power, right, as it relates to solidarity, um, and risk? What are some things we should consider, should observe, should reflect on?
Mhm. Yeah. So power is a real outcome of transformative solidarity because what it can often signify is that we're able to share power, are able to co-govern in a way that leads us to the types of policies and structural changes that we need. And this means that people, when they're engaging in this in solidarity practice to build power, will actually center those who are directly affected, will think about when they're messaging how they're talking about the outcome of solidarity, will often build their capacity to deal with any conflicts that emerge, because power can actually be a way in which solidarity tells us this is how things can look like if we engage in those practices. An example I'll quickly give is the last week of August was the 20th anniversary of Katrina and the aftermath. And one of the ways in which solidarity was practiced, particularly in the South, was through this lens of shared power. Or co-governance. So, what does it mean, for example, to understand that when the state has abandoned you, that communities can come together and build a process of collective stewardship of land and water, right? What does that look like? And that idea is really what led organizers in the South for the past 20 years to build various programs, whether it's in Mobile, Alabama, or in New Orleans, to think about this collective stewardship. And in New Orleans, in particular, a group of Vietnamese residents engaged in this practice to provide recommendations on what to do with the waterway that went through their neighborhood, right? So that's an example of that kind of it's not, solidarity isn't just about doing it for the sake of doing it, it's to create something else. So in this case, as you mentioned, shared power over decisions, particularly when the state has abandoned a community.
Thank you for that. And that is an amazing example. I think some like we focus on solidarity and like risk so much that like even I was like thinking about like, okay, what power we have and therefore what risk should we take, but the idea of the risk itself is creating the
Yes.
power. Amen. So just
Paves the
uh,
way. Yes.
uh, thank you. And right, and the reality that you're talking about, you know, all these different communities, right, attempting to practice solidarity together. I think it's unfortunate because like when the crisis happens, sometimes the barriers disappear. So you do see the people of all different political persuasions, of all different backgrounds, when there is particularly a like natural or sometimes an unnatural disaster coming together to care for one another. They're not asking each other who they voted for, right? Or where their money is invested. They're actually just trying to figure out how can we all survive this together. And then we go, look, see, people are good, right? And then, right, the crisis maybe subsides, and then we go back to our corners and find the reasons why we refuse to work with one another or why we're going to fight for policy for us and not for others. Um, and so in movement spaces, of course, we talk about, right, generative conflict, right? Not the conflict that tears us apart, but the conflict that can actually bring us together. And so how do we choose when we lean into conflict as a part of solidarity? And when do we actually need to go, okay, we're going to move a little bit back because we actually can't practice this well in these conditions?
Yeah, I think that, one of the things that often happens with solidarity practice is that there's this assumption that we're all going to hold hands and be on the same page because we have like the same visions, right? But as we all know, that is rarely true unless you, I think, built relationships over the course of decades and you really trust each other. Conflict is unavoidable, it is inevitable, and it happens in any relationship that seeks to be transformative, that seeks to change and shift, and not be stagnant and the same. And so with movements, we see those kinds of conflicts emerge. The question of whether it's worth it to engage or not is, I think, what we've seen is it depends on a couple of different types of considerations. So one is what is most important to the cause, right? Removing the ego from the ecosystem is something I often talk about. So what is important for the ecosystem, not for my ego or my organization's ego, credit and control, right? So that's an important question. So removing ourselves. The second is if working, actually, I think Mary in the chat has said this so well, conflict can be productive. Is working through this conflict going to lead us to a deeper understanding of each other, a realignment or a recalibration of our values, a different strategy to figure out how to get to the outcome we need, right? So is there going to be a productive piece to this? And then a third is really around accountability and harm. And I think that those words are used a lot, and it's really important to understand what is harm and what is accountability. Sarah Schulman actually has written about this. I know we were talking about her earlier when we were writing to each other about solidarity. But it's really important to think about having agreements, community agreements in place when we enter into relationships with each other as a network or an ecosystem. One of those agreements should be something like, we know conflict is inevitable, and this is what we're going to do to deal with it when it happens. And that's something that the group would work out. I always encourage folks to bring in healers into these sorts of spaces where you know conflict will occur, because rather than wait until after it occurs, because healers can help set the container and hold the space, right? So those are all ways in which we can get prepared for conflict to emerge rather than be jarred and shaken up when it comes up.
Oh, yes, bring the healer in the room. I really like the like is working through this conflict actually going to, I think that is a very rigorous question, and can help us avoid some things. It's like, do we want to fight, or do we want to fight for something? We have 2 minutes left, so I want to ask this final question of like, we have UUs, many UUs in the building who are representing congregations. For organizations specifically who want to deepen their practice of solidarity, what are 2 or 3 concrete practices that you are, recommending for us to take up or to consider?
I think I would say one is, and my therapist would be so proud of me for saying this, is to do the inner work. So whether that is individually to understand how bias shows up in ourselves, right? Or as an organization to figure out what are our values around solidarity, that inner work is really important, and it can be messy, as I mentioned. It should be messy because if it's easy, as you said, Nicole, we wouldn't be here. So, like, give in to the messiness, right? And the imperfection. A second practice is to actually, depending on who we are, like what kind of demographic we represent, to actually do learning. So inner work and learning, really important. So whether that is building relationships with other organizations or different communities in our area, whether it is going to events to learn, reading, right? Reading community media. So really understanding what the particular issue is that you might be concerned about, what, say it's climate justice, how has that affected different types of communities, understanding the connections and commonalities without flattening them. And then I think the third piece is to start to take some steps and to understand that we always have a chance to redo it. That solidarity is an iterative practice, it's a verb. So I mess up all the time when it comes to solidarity practice. I make mistakes. I say the wrong thing. I don't say anything when I should. And it's it's important to understand that the point is to keep trying and keep doing it and listen and learn, and not to just say no more because it's too hard or I messed up or I don't know everything. So to take those small action steps over and over and have sort of an internal feedback loop, and hopefully one in which you're having that feedback loop in community with others, because the community grounded aspect is key when it comes to solidarity too.
Thank you. Yes, we can always come back to our solidarity practice. And luckily, we have these tools that you shared with us because we, I know on Side with Love, are always coming back to those as well as we are trying to figure our way through this moment. Thank you so much. It is always wonderful to be in conversation with you, and deep gratitude for the work that you're doing.
Thank you, Nicole. Thank you so much.
Thanks.
You are God.